Margaret wiped the sweat from her forehead as she walked down the hallway of the community center. At 60 years old, she still moved with the grace of the competitive swimmer she had once been. Her silver hair was tied back in a neat bun, and her blue eyes still sparkled with life despite the wrinkles that framed them. "Excuse me, ma'am," called out the janitor, waving a yellow sign. "The women's changing room is closed for cleaning. There's a pipe leak." Margaret sighed. She had just finished teaching her advanced swimming class and needed to change out of her damp swimsuit. "When will it be ready?" "Not today, for sure. You can use the staff room at the end of the hall." Margaret nodded and headed in that direction, but her mind was on her grocery list for dinner. She pushed open a door without looking at the sign and stepped inside. The changing room looked different, but she was too tired to notice at first. She had already pulled her swimming cap off and was reaching for the zipper of her suit when she heard a gasp. Margaret turned around and froze. A young man stood there, his hair still dripping from the shower, a towel wrapped around his waist. His eyes were wide with shock, and his mouth hung open. "Oh my goodness!" Margaret clutched her towel to her chest. "I'm so sorry. I wasn't looking, I thought this was." The young man grabbed another towel and held it up like a shield. "This is the men's room," he said, his voice cracking slightly. Margaret felt her face grow hot. "The women's is closed for repairs. I was told to use the staff room, but I must have taken a wrong turn." She backed toward the door, bumping into a bench. "I'm very sorry." The young man's surprise turned to a small smile. "It's okay, honest mistake." Margaret couldn't help noticing his kind eyes and the dimple that appeared when he smiled. He was probably in his 20s with broad shoulders and a swimmer's build. "I'm Tom," he said unexpectedly, still keeping his distance. "Margaret Wilson. I teach the advanced class on Tuesdays and Thursdays." She didn't know why she was still talking instead of leaving. Something about his friendly face made the awkward moment less embarrassing. "I know," Tom said. "I joined last week. You're really good. I mean, at teaching." He shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable but trying to be polite. A drip of water fell from his hair onto his shoulder, and Margaret suddenly remembered where they were. "I should go," she said quickly. "Again, I'm very sorry for barging in." "No harm done," Tom replied with a slight laugh. "See you at the pool, I guess." Margaret hurried out, her heart racing from the strange encounter. She found the correct staff room and changed into her dry clothes, but her hands were shaking a little. It had been years since she had seen a half-dressed man other than her late husband. The memory of Tom's surprised face kept appearing in her mind. When she finally left the building, Margaret spotted Tom in the parking lot. He was fully dressed now, loading a backpack into his car. He looked up and caught her eye. Instead of looking away in embarrassment, he smiled and waved. Margaret waved back before getting into her own car. She sat there for a moment, her hands on the steering wheel, and found herself smiling. How silly to feel this fluttering in her stomach at her age. It was just an awkward moment, that's all. But as she drove home, she realized she was looking forward to Thursday's class in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. The changing room incident should have been nothing more than an embarrassing story to laugh about later. Margaret had no idea that it was actually the beginning of something that would change both their lives. 2 days later, Margaret stood at the edge of the pool watching her students practice their strokes. She tried to focus on their form, but her eyes kept drifting to lane 3 where Tom was swimming. His technique was good, strong and smooth with barely a splash. She noticed how the water flowed over his shoulders and back as he moved. "Mrs. Wilson," a student was talking to her. "Is my arm position correct?" Margaret snapped back to attention. "Let me see you try again," she said, forcing herself to concentrate. What was wrong with her today? Since the changing room incident, she had thought about Tom more than she cared to admit. After class ended, Margaret sat on a bench organizing her lesson plans for next week. The pool area slowly emptied as students headed to the showers. She didn't notice Tom approaching until he sat down beside her. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, towel draped around his neck. His dark hair was wet and pushed back from his forehead. "Not at all," Margaret replied, trying to sound casual. "You've improved your breathing technique. Much better timing today." Tom smiled. "Thanks to your tips. I was wondering if..." He paused, looking nervous. "If you might have time for a coffee? I'd like to ask about training for the regional competition. Margaret felt a flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with swimming advice. I suppose I could spare a few minutes. There's a cafe across the street. They walked together in the sunshine, an odd pair, the tall young man and the older woman with streaks of gray in her hair. At the cafe, they found a quiet corner table. I used to compete when I was younger, Margaret said after Tom asked about her swimming background. Nothing major, just state level, but I loved every minute of it. Is that why you teach? Tom stirred his coffee slowly. Partly. After my husband died 5 years ago, I needed something to fill my days. Margaret hadn't meant to share something so personal. What was it about this young man that made her open up? I'm sorry about your husband. Tom's eyes were kind. My dad passed away when I was in high school. Cancer. Mine too, Margaret said softly. Life changes in an instant, doesn't it? They talked for over an hour. Tom was studying engineering and worked part-time at a bookstore. Margaret told him about her daughter who lived 2 states away and her small house with the garden she tended each spring. My friends think I'm crazy for taking swim lessons, Tom admitted. They say I should be at parties or playing video games. But there's something peaceful about being in the water. Margaret nodded. The pool has always been my happy place. No noise, no demands. Just you and the water. Exactly. Tom's face lit up. Nobody else gets it. As they prepared to leave, Tom hesitated. There's a small orchestra playing at the park this Sunday. Classical music, which you mentioned you like. Would you want to go? As friends, of course. Margaret's first instinct was to say no. What would people think, seeing them together? But the hopeful look in Tom's eyes made her pause. Just as friends, she repeated, more to herself than to him. Absolutely. I could use some culture in my life, he grinned, and someone who appreciates Beethoven as much as I do. Walking home, Margaret wondered if she was being foolish. At her age, she should know better than to spend time with a man young enough to be her son. Yet Tom's company made her feel alive in a way she hadn't experienced since before her husband got sick. That night, Margaret looked at herself in the mirror, the wrinkles around her eyes, the softness beneath her chin. What was she doing? But another voice inside her whispered, why not enjoy this friendship? Why not feel young again, even if just for a little while? She touched her reflection and smiled. Sunday suddenly seemed very far away. Sunday arrived with perfect weather. Margaret spent more time than usual choosing what to wear. She finally picked a light blue dress that her daughter had given her for her birthday. It was simple but elegant, not too young or too old. She added a white cardigan and small pearl earrings. It's not a date, she reminded herself as she applied a touch of lipstick. We're just 2 friends enjoying music. Tom was waiting at the park entrance with 2 folding chairs. His face brightened when he saw her. You look lovely, he said, then quickly added, I brought chairs so we don't have to sit on the grass. Margaret felt relief at his thoughtfulness. At her age, getting up from the ground wasn't as easy as it used to be. They found a spot under a maple tree where they could see the small stage. Other people were spreading blankets or setting up chairs. Margaret noticed most were couples or families. An older woman walking by gave them a curious look. My student and I are here for the music. Margaret wanted to explain, but said nothing. The orchestra began to play Mozart. Margaret closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her. When she opened them, she found Tom watching her instead of the musicians. What? She asked. You look happy, he said simply. It's nice to see. During intermission, Tom bought them ice cream cones. They walked along the park path, licking their treats like children. My wife never understood why I love classical music, Tom said suddenly. Margaret nearly stopped walking. Your wife? Ex-wife, Tom clarified. We got married right after college, lasted 18 months. He looked at his ice cream. She said I was boring, too serious about everything. Margaret didn't know what to say. She had assumed Tom was single, never married. I'm sorry, she finally offered. Don't be. It was 3 years ago. Best thing that could have happened, looking back. They reached a small pond where ducks swam in lazy circles. What about you? Tom asked. Was your husband a swimmer too? Margaret smiled at the memory. Frank couldn't swim a stroke when I met him. I taught him. He never got very good, but he tried because he knew I loved it. He sounds like a good man. The best, Margaret said softly. We were married 35 years. Tom whistled. That's amazing. What's the secret? Kindness, Margaret answered without hesitation. Being kind even when you don't feel like it. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the ducks. A small boy ran past them, chasing a ball. His mother called after him, Jamie, be careful. Do you have children? Margaret asked. Tom shook his head. Never got that far. You mentioned a daughter. Lisa. She lives in Portland with her husband. They're trying for a baby. Margaret smiled. I might be a grandmother soon. You be a wonderful grandmother, Tom said. The sincerity in his voice made Margaret blush. They returned to their seats as the orchestra prepared for the second half. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over everything. This has been perfect, Tom whispered as the music began again. Margaret nodded, but inside she felt confused. She enjoyed Tom's company more than she wanted to admit. There was an ease between them that felt rare and precious. But what was he looking for from her? What was she looking for from him? As the final notes faded away, the crowd applauded. Margaret joined in, suddenly aware of how close Tom was sitting. Their shoulders almost touched. They're playing Beethoven next month, Tom said as they folded their chairs. Would you like to come again? Margaret hesitated. She should say no. End this strange friendship before it became complicated. Before people started talking. Before her own feelings became too tangled to sort out. I'd like that, she heard herself say instead. Tom's smile was worth any future regrets. As they walked to the parking lot, he briefly touched her elbow to guide her around a puddle. That small contact sent a warm feeling through Margaret's arm. Just friends, she reminded herself again, but even as she thought it, she knew something was changing between them. Something neither had planned or expected. Something that both thrilled and frightened her. Margaret's phone rang early Saturday morning. It was her daughter Lisa. Mom, how are you? I haven't heard from you in 2 weeks. Margaret felt a pang of guilt. She had been so caught up in her swimming classes and her growing friendship with Tom that she had forgotten their weekly call. I'm sorry, dear. I've been busy with the community center. You sound different, Lisa said. Is everything okay? Margaret hesitated. Should she tell her daughter about Tom? They had been spending more time together. Coffee after swimming class, walks in the park, even a trip to the bookstore where Tom worked part-time. I've made a new friend, Margaret said carefully. That's great. Another swimming teacher? No, actually. He's a student in my advanced class. There was a pause. How old is this student? Margaret took a deep breath. 24. The silence that followed felt endless. Mom. Lisa finally said, her voice tight. What are you doing? It's not what you're thinking. We're just friends who enjoy the same things. A 60-year-old woman and a 24-year-old man don't have the same things in common. Lisa's voice rose. People will talk. Let them talk, Margaret said, surprising herself with her firmness. Tom is kind and thoughtful, and I enjoy his company. Is he using you for something? Money? A better grade in class? Lisa, that's enough. Margaret rarely used that tone with her daughter. Tom is a good person. I wish you could meet him before judging him. The conversation ended awkwardly, with Lisa promising to call next week. Margaret put down the phone, her hands shaking slightly. Was her daughter right? Was this friendship inappropriate? The doorbell rang, startling her. Tom stood on her porch, holding a small potted plant. You mentioned your garden needs color, he said, handing her the purple flowers. African violets. The lady at the store said they're easy to care for. Margaret invited him in. Her small house was neat but old-fashioned, with furniture she'd owned for decades. She wondered how it looked through Tom's young eyes. This is nice, he said, looking around. It feels like a real home. They had tea in the kitchen. Margaret told him about Lisa's call. She thinks I'm after your money? Tom looked genuinely hurt, or trying to get special treatment in class. She's protective, Margaret explained, and confused. So am I sometimes. Tom stared into his tea. My friend Steve asked if you were like a mother figure to me, since I lost my dad young. He looked up at Margaret. I told him no. What I feel for you isn't like that at all. The air between them suddenly felt charged. Margaret's heart beat faster. What do you feel? She asked quietly. Tom moved his chair closer. I feel comfortable with you. I can talk to you about things I can't discuss with people my age. But it's more than that. He reached for her hand across the table. There's something special about you, Margaret. I can't explain it. His fingers were warm against hers. Margaret knew she should pull away, but didn't want to. People won't understand, she whispered. Do we need them to? Tom asked. A memory flashed through Margaret's mind, Frank telling her not to care so much what others thought. Live your life, Maggie, he used to say. It's too short to waste on other people's opinions. The kitchen clock ticked loudly in the silence. Outside, a bird sang. Time seemed suspended as they looked at each other. I'm too old for you, Margaret finally said. Maybe I'm an old soul, Tom replied with a half-smile. Or maybe age isn't as important as everyone thinks. He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to move away if she wanted. Margaret stayed still, barely breathing, as his lips touched her cheek in a gentle kiss. It wasn't romantic, not exactly, but it wasn't entirely friendly either. It existed in a new space between categories where Margaret hadn't been before. I should go, Tom said softly. Think about coming to dinner at my apartment next Friday? I'm not a great cook, but I make decent pasta. After he left, Margaret touched her cheek where he had kissed her. 60 years old, and she felt like a teenager, unsure and excited at the same time. Her phone rang again, Liza probably calling back to apologize or argue more. Margaret let it go to voicemail. For once, she didn't want anyone else's voice in her head. She only wanted to listen to her own heart. Tom's apartment was small but neat. Books lined the shelves, and classical music played softly in the background. The table was set with a checkered cloth and candles. Margaret felt both touched and nervous as she handed him the bottle of wine she had brought. This is too nice for my cooking, Tom joked, examining the label. It was my husband's favorite, Margaret said. She hadn't shared Frank's special wine with anyone since he died. Tom seemed to understand the significance. He carefully opened the bottle and poured 2 glasses. To new beginnings, he said, raising his glass. The pasta was simple but good. They talked easily about books they loved and places they wanted to visit. Margaret found herself laughing more than she had in years. After dinner, they sat on Tom's small balcony, watching the city lights. The night was cool, and Tom draped a blanket over Margaret's shoulders. His hand lingered there for a moment. Can I ask you something personal? Tom said. Margaret nodded, wondering what was coming. Do you ever feel like you're running out of time? The question surprised her. At my age, that's a daily feeling, she admitted. Why do you ask? Tom leaned against the railing, looking out at the night. I've always felt like I'm searching for something. Everyone my age seems focused on careers and partying and dating apps, but I want something deeper. He looked back at her. That's what I found with you. Real conversation, real connection. Margaret sipped her wine. You should be having those connections with someone your own age, someone you could build a future with. I've tried, Tom said. My marriage. A few relationships after. They all felt shallow compared to this. He moved closer to her on the small bench. I know it sounds crazy. I know people will judge us. But I feel something for you that I can't ignore. Margaret's heart raced. She should leave now, before things went further. Before she let herself believe this could work. I should go, she said, standing up. It's getting late. Tom stood too, his face showing disappointment. Did I say something wrong? No, Margaret said gently. You said everything right. That's what scares me. He walked her to the door. As she reached for the handle, Tom touched her arm. When I was 10, my grandmother told me something I never forgot, he said. She said most people miss happiness because it doesn't come in the package they expected. Their eyes met, and Margaret felt something shift inside her. Without thinking, she leaned forward and kissed him lightly on the lips. It was brief, but it sent warmth through her entire body. Good night, Tom, she whispered, then hurried out the door before she could change her mind. All the way home, Margaret's thoughts swirled. What was she doing? This couldn't possibly lead anywhere good. Tom deserved someone young, someone who could give him children, someone with a future ahead of them. Not a woman nearing retirement with gray hair and arthritis in her knees. At home, Margaret checked her phone. 3 missed calls from Lisa and a text. Mom, please call me. I'm worried about you. She would call her daughter tomorrow. Tonight, she needed to think. Margaret went to her bedroom and opened the closet. In the back hung Frank's old sweater. She had kept it all these years, sometimes holding it close when she missed him most. "What will you tell me to do, Frank?" she asked the empty room. The answer came as clearly as if he had spoken. "Be happy, Maggie, whatever that means now." Margaret sat on the edge of her bed, suddenly tired but strangely peaceful. Perhaps Tom was right about happiness coming in unexpected packages. Perhaps, at 60, she was allowed to feel young again, to feel wanted, to follow her heart instead of society's rules. Her phone buzzed with a text from Tom. "Thank you for tonight. Sweet dreams." Margaret smiled and typed back, "You too." Then, after a moment's hesitation, she added a heart emoji. Small steps, she thought. We'll take small steps and see where this leads. Word spread quickly at the community center. Margaret noticed the whispers and stares during her swimming classes. 2 regular students suddenly dropped out. The center manager, Bill, called her into his office one Tuesday afternoon. "Margaret, you've been with us for years," Bill said, not quite meeting her eyes. "You're one of our best instructors." "Thank you," Margaret said, though she could sense bad news coming. Bill cleared his throat. "Some parents have expressed concerns about your relationship with a student." Margaret's face grew hot. "My personal life is my business." "Normally, yes. But Tom is enrolled in your class. It creates a conflict of interest." "I've never shown him special treatment," Margaret protested. "I believe you," Bill said kindly. "But appearances matter. Perhaps Tom could switch to another instructor's class." Margaret left the office feeling humiliated. In the hallway, she overheard 2 women talking. "Probably having a midlife crisis," one said. "At 60, it's more like an end-of-life crisis," the other replied, laughing. Margaret hurried past them, eyes burning with tears she refused to shed. She had faced gossip before, when Frank was sick and when he died. But this felt different, more personal, more shameful. She drove straight to Tom's apartment without calling first. He answered the door in sweatpants and a t-shirt, looking surprised but happy to see her. "This isn't working," Margaret said as soon as she stepped inside. "People are talking. I might lose my job." Tom's smile faded. "What happened?" Margaret told him about the meeting with Bill and the comments she'd overheard. Her voice shook as she spoke. "I knew this would happen," she said. "I was foolish to think we could just ignore what everyone would say." Tom tried to take her hand, but she moved away. "I care about you, not what other people think," he said. "That's because you're young. You don't understand how this will affect me, my reputation. I've lived in this town for 40 years. "So what do you want to do?" Tom asked, his voice quiet. The question hung in the air. What did she want? To end things now, before they got more complicated? To go back to her safe, predictable life? "I don't know," Margaret admitted. Tom moved closer. "I was going to tell you tonight anyway. I got offered a job in Boston. Good money. Doing engineering work I care about." Margaret felt her heart sink. "You're leaving." "I was going to ask you to come with me." The words hit her like a physical force. "Come with you? To Boston? Leave everything here?" "A fresh start," Tom said, his eyes bright with excitement. "No one would know us there. No history, no judgment." "My whole life is here," Margaret said. "My friends, my memories of Frank." "Frank would want you to be happy," Tom reminded her gently. "I have a daughter, grandchildren coming. Boston has airports," Tom said with a small smile. "And trains, and highways." Margaret sat down on Tom's couch, feeling overwhelmed. Leave everything behind? At her age? Start over in a new city with a man 36 years younger than her? "This is crazy," she whispered. Tom knelt in front of her. "Love is always a little crazy." He had never used that word before. Love. It hung in the air between them, changing everything. "Is that what this is?" Margaret asked. Instead of answering, Tom leaned forward and kissed her. This time it wasn't brief or gentle. It was deep and certain, and Margaret felt herself responding, all her doubts temporarily silenced by the feeling of his lips on hers, his hands in her hair. When they finally pulled apart, Margaret's heart was racing. "I don't need an answer right now," Tom said. "I start the job in 3 weeks. Think about it." That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She stared at the ceiling, thinking about Frank, about her daughter, about the community center. About Boston. About Tom. What would it be like to start fresh? To walk down streets where no one knew her as poor Frank Wilson's widow or Lisa's mother, or that 60-year-old swimming teacher dating a boy. Just Margaret and Tom. Together. Figuring it out day by day. Her phone lit up with a text. It was from Tom. "Whatever you decide, I meant what I didn't say earlier. I love you." Margaret read the message 3 times, then she pressed the phone to her heart and finally began to cry. 3 weeks passed in a blur of decisions and goodbyes. Margaret put her house up for sale, packed 40 years of memories into boxes, and had a long, tearful conversation with Lisa. "I don't understand," her daughter had said. "You're giving up everything for someone you barely know." "I'm not giving up everything," Margaret explained. "I'm choosing something new." The hardest part was visiting Frank's grave one last time. Margaret laid flowers against the stone and sat on the small bench nearby. "I'll always love you," she whispered. "But I need to let myself live again." Today was moving day. Margaret stood in her empty living room, sunlight streaming through the windows onto bare floors. The furniture was gone, sold, or given away. Just a few boxes remained, waiting for the movers. Her phone rang. It was Tom, just checking in. "How are you feeling?" "Scared," Margaret admitted, excited, a little sad. "I'll see you tonight," Tom said. "We can have dinner in our new place." Our place. The words still felt strange. They had found a 2-bedroom apartment in Boston, not far from Tom's new job. Margaret had already contacted swimming centers there about teaching positions. The doorbell rang. Margaret expected the movers, but instead found Lisa standing on the porch. "I had to see you before you left," Lisa said, her eyes red from crying. Margaret hugged her daughter tightly. "I'm only moving to Boston, not the moon. You can visit any time." Lisa pulled back, wiping her eyes. "I brought something for you." She handed Margaret a small box. Inside was a delicate silver bracelet with a single charm, a swimming figure. "I had it made," Lisa explained. "It's supposed to be you swimming forward." Margaret felt tears well up. "It's perfect. I want you to be happy, Mom. I'm trying to understand." Lisa took a deep breath. "Tom called me yesterday." Margaret's eyebrows rose in surprise. "He did. He wanted to reassure me about his intentions. He said he knows it seems strange from the outside, but that you've brought him more joy than he ever expected to find." Lisa smiled reluctantly. "He sounds sincere." "He is," Margaret said simply. They sat together on the porch steps, mother and daughter, watching as the moving truck pulled up. The movers began loading Margaret's few remaining boxes. "What if it doesn't work out?" Lisa asked quietly. Margaret considered this. "Then I'll start again. That's what life is, starting again when things end." The last box was loaded. It was time to go. "I love you," Lisa said, hugging her mother one more time. "Call me when you get there." Margaret drove slowly through town, past the community center where it all began, past the park where she and Tom had listened to music, past the coffee shop where they had talked for hours. So many memories in such a short time. The highway stretched ahead, leading to Boston, to Tom, to whatever came next. 5 hours later, tired but excited, Margaret parked outside her new building. Tom was waiting, leaning against the wall, his face lighting up when he saw her. "Welcome home," he said, helping her from the car. Their apartment was on the 3rd floor, bright and modern, with large windows overlooking a small park. Tom had already unpacked some things. Flowers sat on the kitchen counter and familiar pictures hung on the walls. "I wanted it to feel like home right away," he explained, watching her reaction carefully. Margaret walked from room to room, touching things, adjusting to this new reality. It wasn't her old house. It wasn't her old life. But somehow, it already felt right. They ate takeout pizza for dinner, sitting on the floor because their furniture wouldn't arrive until tomorrow. Tom poured wine into paper cups and raised a toast. "To new beginnings," he said. Later, they stood on their small balcony, looking at the city lights. Tom wrapped his arms around Margaret from behind, and she leaned back against his chest. "Any regrets?" he asked softly. Margaret thought about the whispers and stares, about her comfortable old life, about all the certainties she had left behind. Then she thought about the feeling of Tom's arms around her, the excitement of this new city, and the unexpected joy of starting over at 60. "Not a single one," she answered, turning in his arms to kiss him. Some people would never understand their story. They would see only the numbers, 60 and 24, and miss everything that mattered, but Margaret and Tom knew better. They had found each other in the most unexpected way, their paths crossing in a changing room of all places, altering the course of both their lives. It wasn't a conventional love story, but then again, the best ones never are.